usually only takes a second. Excellent. All right. Happy Sunday. Welcome. It is February 28th, Sunday. I'm Dustin Price in Chicago. Today we're talking with David Salvo in Bloomington, Indiana.
Hey, how you doing there, Dustin?
Doing good. We're doing good. We've gotten through a lot of the snow. Now it's turned to ice, and everything on the building is falling off. How about you?
Snow has melted, then we got rain, so now we are well into Indiana mud season.
Indiana mud season. Oh,
Very fishy out.
oh. So last week we were talking about where we get our news, how narratives are propagated, our own. I kind of went into like a carrot versus stick response to issues, even in our own mind, and also how self-publishing might run up against traditional news gatekeepers. So today we're going to expand our discussion on the news media, and we hope to talk about, how you formulate your current opinions and conclusions. Did it change after you learned more? And what was your opinion before a specific news issue? And then also, where would you go to find someone who agrees with you? Where would you go to find someone who disagrees? Where would you go for facts on things? It's like, who are your gatekeepers and how do they affect you? All right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Before we do that, we're going to try a little, if you can bear with me, we're going to try a little new technical thing of a poll. Now, these are news items, and we don't actually have to talk about any of them. I just want to see how the poll works. I took the news items from my feed, and I want to get news items from other people's feeds, and I get other bubbles, but just kind of doing a poll of what are the news. So not what I was looking for, but what seems to be thrown at me. So I'm going to launch this poll. Now, can you see the poll?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm hoping it records the poll. This is the thing we'll find out later. I should have tested this first. But on this, some of these things, I'll just kind of read them out because it's fun, because I had fun typing out the headlines. First thing I noticed was raising the minimum wage is out, bombing Syria is in. There's also a microchip supply chain crisis. We all know about the PPE crisis. Well, we don't make microchips here anymore, and that might be an issue since everything has them. The other item in the news is the kids are no longer in cages. They're in facilities. And how the language has changed from my left media because now we have a Democratic president. And, there was also all of Australia is canceled. If you realize they were deplatformed, the entire country. And then the censorship of the left is exploding. Of all these people on the independent media are like, my videos just can't seem to get out there anymore. Another one of Saudis don't get punished for killing journalists. Remember that whole thing? Well, that's still being worked out. Not in a great way either. Open source vaccines versus Bill Gates profiteering. Well, what's good with a world-saving cure if you can't make a buck off of it? Julian Assange is still getting ignored. China isn't actually genociding the Uyghurs. Sorry. That's a fun little exercise in identifying propaganda, because there is bad things going on, but the way the news is talking about it from my perspective, it's a little propaganda. There's the US-backed autocratic coups are expanding. We have a lot of new members of this club. Lots of fun, exciting things happening in our war machine. And new documents come out about the FBI's assassination of Malcolm X and labor leader Fred Hampton. So.
It's quite the smorgasbord of news.
So I guess I can't select a poll answer. Can you select a poll answer?
I am Going to select one. Yes, I have selected one. Can I select more than one?
Yeah, this is a multiple choice.
Okay. Um,
And as I see, yeah, I'm gonna play around with this. And a lot of times the polls I might actually release early. I'm also going to try to practice doing this live because it'd be kind of neat if there were less questions.
Sure.
Let me know when you're done.
All right, I've selected a few things there.
Okay, so that pops up. All right. Raising the minimum wages out, bombing Syria's in, microchip supply chain crisis, and Saudis don't get punished for killing journalists. All right. And polling, I wouldn't mind of this. The Syria question, there's a lot of investigative journalism. It's of these, this is probably the largest, most complicated issue. A lot of different moving parts. Supply chain, we can talk about in a more general way. And then the Saudis don't get punished for killing journalists. I have to remember all the facts on that, which I don't think I'm going to do on the fly unless you can. So
I may have a few. It's an issue having worked as a professional journalist, not abroad, obviously, but having some connection to that field. It's an area that is fairly close to my heart. So a general discussion of it and our seemingly intractable, indivisible relationship with the Saudi government would be an interesting topic to discuss for many reasons. So, yeah.
all right. Now, how do I end the poll? Okay. We'll see later if that popped up on the video or not. I should have been watching YouTube at the same time. Actually, I think I can. I don't think it did. I was just popping over there. Anyway, we'll work out that technical glitch. But all right, Saudis and journalists, if that's kind of the topic that'll help us kind of focus on our general gatekeeper questions. Is that cool?
Sure. No, that's fantastic.
All right, all right. So let's start with, if I can, I need like several monitors. So let's talk about our opinions before we learned about Saudi hacking up journalists in hotel rooms and that sort of thing. What was our opinion of how the Saudis or any autocratic government treating journalists and how the United States treats journalists? And I'm going to talk a lot about Assange too.
Sure.
What was your opinion going in?
So there's been over the last few years, as the new crown prince, because he's still relatively new, became ascendant, there were a lot, he tried to telegraph a lot of intentions to change the country, change a lot of the social dynamic, being a little more modern, a little more open. Let's let women drive. Let's build some theme parks and actually do some Western style tourism and that kind of thing. And talked a lot about economic diversification, which is of crucial importance to what is essentially a closed mob regime. I mean,
right. They did spread some of that oil money around. You got to give them that.
But they don't really spread it to the people, and so they're a victim of what scholars tend to call the resource curse. Right? They have a lot of money that they receive, a lot of revenue that they raise through invasive or extractive industries, but those industries aren't diversified. They're managed by the government. It's a national industry. Everybody in the country works for the most part in that industry. There's not a very diverse economy. They make money on oil, and then their next biggest export is dates, I think, on which they lose 20 cents or something. So they're just not very economically diverse. A lot of financial services and stuff too, but there's not a lot of transparency there.
That's what I saw of they're diversifying the rich people's portfolio into our assets as opposed to spreading it around.
Exactly. So a big problem with, and this is this model or this problem rears its head in a lot of other developing countries, particularly that are mineral rich or extractive industry heavy. Sudan is a big one, although they've done some other more interesting things to try to get around, to create an end run around this problem. So there was a lot of telegraphing that the regime was going to change, that they were going to be more open, that they were going to be a little bit more modern and try to work within what's always been their hyper-conservative framework to try to make people a little happier. And so there was some hope, and I guess my opinion initially, prior to Khashoggi's murder, there was this hope of, I don't know, this guy, that he was going to be a modern Ataturk, that he was going to reform, he was going to modernize, and there was a little bit of hope. After Khashoggi's murder, and particularly after it became very evident very quickly who the responsible parties were, and I might be getting out and putting the cart in front of the horse, my opinion certainly changed, and it reinforces the long held belief that I've had and a lot of other scholars of the region and the royal family in particular, the House of Saud in particular, that they have no intention of opening up. They continue, they want to be as closed and cloistered, if you will, as possible, because they don't really have any interest to do so, that they seem to
no
be
pressure to do so. Yeah. And that was kind of, I think I'm a similar opinion of, there's a general hope because one, there's generational change, and that's inevitable. So you got your new generation of princes, and then you got they're going to be forced to change anyway. Just global economics, global warming. They're in a desert. They can't help but be affected by those change. But then we see this, and I'm like, well, maybe that was a lot weaker than I thought, because they seem to be entrenching and doubling down.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and it does seem to be that way. And they are, as far as I know, they're making investments in desalination, and they're looking ahead toward water scarcity. There's an old quote from a long ago energy minister who worked for OPEC, and somebody was talking to him, and I forget the context exactly in what interview and in what capacity, but they said something about, oh, isn't it wonderful? Like, you have all this oil, you've got 16 elephant graveyards you haven't even tapped yet. Like, it's, this is fantastic. You've got oil forever. And the energy minister's comment was something to the effect of, all things being equal, I wish we had discovered water. It would be better for us. So I know that they're certainly clever enough to be looking ahead and understanding that water scarcity, it's something that they've consistently dealt with, being that they are where they are, and that's been kind of the nature of their existence. But they're making some investments. The interesting thing is that the money that comes from all of these extractive industries, you can build a few theme parks and you can let women drive, but that money isn't really, it's still not going back into public infrastructure or additional job creation. That, it's all still, that money is all still kind of maintained by essentially a corrupt family government. Right. And it's essentially run like a mob, and they're This kind of pushes us toward, they are the ultimate gatekeepers of their country. So they broach no dissent. They control the media.
They're making their population, what I can see, and this is that bait and switch of, we're going to make sure you have just enough food and water, but we're not going to guarantee your independence. Like, this was the idea that I keep coming back to. I want a mixture of left and right. This is my compromise mind of, I want a guarantee for the basics of life in order to establish a merit-based economy. So it's like the basics should be government regulated, maybe not owned, but at least regulated. So the basics are provided. And then anything other than that, you have the freedom now to go and you can live the basic life on your couch. You're not going to die. You're not going to be homeless. You're also not going to do anything. Or you can, because you are not afraid of being homeless if you fail, you can now go do a venture. So if they had they're doing the first a little bit, just so to prevent a revolution, not to actually be nice to their people. But they're not doing the second part of, okay, now that I've provided for you, now go and be more productive, and that will just affect all of us. It's, no, we're still in charge. I just don't want you to chop my head off.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I think you're right. Like, it's a typical autocratic playbook. Give people just enough. Whenever there's dissent, you let off the steam by deflecting to some other thing. For example, a neighbor like Syria is having all this trouble, and so you pick a side and you take the anger and the unrest in what is one of the youngest, fastest growing populations in the country, in the world rather, and you have young people and the generation before them who is still aging rapidly and very, very young. And instead of giving them time to realize that they're really not going to have any choice in terms of, maybe they can work at one of the new theme parks, but chances are they're going to pick and export dates and lose money, or they're going to farm, lambs, or they're going to work for Saudi Aramco. And you probably can't work for Saudi Aramco unless somebody in your family already has, because it's not a merit-based system.
True.
So you deflect all of that frustration and you let the steam off by, all right, women can drive, and then we'll let the men and the women in their homes fight about whether or not that's even a good idea. We're going to deflect that, right? We're going to let men be mad at their wives instead of us. We're going to do that. And then we're also going to deflect that revolutionary zeal that could turn toward us, and we're going to deflect it somewhere else. We're going to make them fight in Syria, or we're going to make them
it's the Israelis' fault.
Or we're going to, we're always a perfect.
I guess they're more mad at Iran than at Israel. So yeah.
But whatever the scapegoat has to be, you send that poor goat out into the wilderness with everybody's perceived sins, and poor goat. And another really good one is a lot of the smaller Gulf states have now begun to make peace with Israel. They've started to decide that it's all right. Like, we don't really want to have a horse in this thing. We'd rather get along and whatever. That's another flashpoint. So now they can further turn any revolutionary pressures, revolutionary ideology outward, away from the ruling house and away from the monarchy, and just deflect and continue to do what they've been doing.
Now, one of my going in opinions was the same thing, just a different take of, because the United States has been able to isolate Iran and kind of really, basically they're shutting out the competition. And so the small Gulf states are like, we could either stay ideologically true or we could eat. So they're like, at some point they have bills to pay too, and they have greedy corporatists too who need to make money. And so this idea of like the turning to Israel is, from my going in perspective, it wasn't because they've sat down and did some self-reflection and realized this, that, and the other about Israel. It's more of, well, those contracts I used to get through Iran, through Russia and China are really up in the air, and the United States has got a bunch of tanks enforcing their contracts, so I'm gonna go with that one. That's what I see.
Sometimes it's a marriage of convenience.
Right,
Exactly.
right, right, right.
It's
Now, I
not
don't
a,
know if that's true or not. That's just what I see.
I mean, we would all love to believe that it's an altruistic decision. It's most likely based on kind of a realpolitik reality check,
Yeah.
based similar to what you're describing. I think that's probably the meat of the decision.
Yeah. The most money I can make with the least amount of people calling from my head.
Well, and I guess who do you really want to be dependent on? Right?
Oh yeah.
You want to be, some of those smaller Gulf states are very heavily dependent on us already. Why have some dependence on us and some dependence on somebody else, particularly if they're uncertain about what the American strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia is going to do?
Yeah.
Kind of seem like
I'll ask a simpler question of if the US in Iraq doesn't nationalize the oil company, they give it to Chevron. So does Iran, let's say, if you went to their sphere of influence and started getting their contracts from their sphere, would Iran insist on nationalizing your oil, or would they say, no, our company, Gazprom, has to buy you out, as opposed to Shell?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know. I think Iran, they still actually make money on a lot of their energy, not as much as you might think, because they are pretty heavily embargoed and sanctioned and whatnot, so they can't sell as broadly as they would otherwise be able to, thanks to us. But they do still make some money, unlike Russia, who actually sells so much energy that they have to buy energy back. So they're actually a net purchaser of energy, despite having some of the greatest natural gas and other energy resources. I'm pretty sure that's still the case, that they actually have to buy energy back.
Oh, that sounds like a wonderful way to fleece your people. Oh, I love
it. Great. There's one of them. It's one of the two of them. And I feel like Iran for a while was close to having to do that they had to sell enough to pay their bills so that they could pay their bills and then buy energy back. Right. So they ended up being a net energy importer despite their resources. And this all kind of still leads us back to this idea of treatment of the press. And Khashoggi was murdered because he was a critic of the Saudi regime. Right. And talk about rhetoric demonizing the press. Like this person was followed until he was somewhere where he was vulnerable, and then viciously murdered.
Viciously, like Quentin Tarantino murdered.
Right, for speaking out. And he was periodically employed by an American company. He was, for all intents and purposes, this is the murder of an outspoken American journalist for all intents and purposes. Mm-hmm. So it does bring us back to treatment of the press, and then who, and eventually we can get to who makes those decisions, who are the gatekeepers and the news, the people that control the flow of that information and all that. But I think it's certainly.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask you on the reaction to the American news reaction. So this was when you hear, and I can never say the name, Khashoggi. I can never say the name. Right? Khashoggi, did I get it right?
Khashoggi.
Khashoggi. When you hear about that, when you hear them talk about that, when you hear them talk about Assange, or even when you hear that one side, like Rachel Maddow talking about Tucker Carlson, or vice versa, this when the news media talks about the news media, the reaction of this is what's perturbing. Because when we hear this, okay, this autocratic regime is kind of confirming a lot of our biases, and we assume in America that we all like freedom of the press, and at least the public. And then we hear about a journalist just being a journalist, and then either getting chopped up into little pieces, or driven crazy in Switzerland, or just generally vilified,
Sure.
if you're on the other side. So this American news treatment of journalism itself caused me to like trigger. I'm like, when did we lose our respect for journalism? Like, wasn't this like a common a general belief among the public that journalism is good? I don't care how it works, like how much you know of it or whatever, it's a good thing, and you should always fight for it. Just like kind of the healthcare is a human right, or you should be able to vote.
Right.
So what was your reactions of the news reactions, the people you watch on the news of the killing and Saudi not getting any consequences for it?
I mean, I think it's a shared reaction of outrage for lack of consequence. And a lot of frustration. And again, I'm not on the inside making policy decisions, or I'm not at the State Department trying to communicate with people in Saudi Arabia or in the neighboring areas, trying to kind of discuss how this is going to get handled. And I'm not a part of that. So I'm sure there's a tremendous, and has been a tremendous amount of discussion through the State Department and communication channels to express to the ruling powers that be in Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince specifically, we're going to have to do something about this. Like, people are pissed about this. Like, it's a big deal. Like, this wasn't a good move on your part. Like, this is, you crossed the Rubicon, dude. So, so I think shared sense of outrage about a lack of consequences. I think that broadly the news media is right to speak strongly about it. I mean, I think it's even as a gut reaction. I think broadly, my experience was that most broadcasters, most journalists, he was one of their own, right? He's doing their job. He's digging up truth, speaking truth, waiting for answers from the powers that be. So very much one of their own. So I think the outrage is real and justified. I think, again, I don't know how much pressure was and continues to be brought to bear on the Crown Prince and the people in his orbit to do something about this. But it's kind of one of those things. It's like, he's not going to suffer any consequences. Crown Prince Abdullah is not going to suffer any consequences, because it's like going in and interviewing for a job with the guy that already has the job that you want, right? He's not going to hire you, right? Nobody's ever going to give you the tools you need to overthrow them. Like, that's just not going to happen. So he's never going to hold himself.
Unless you're a real Christian.
Right? And even then, I have a feeling that it's not going to happen. So he's never going to hold himself accountable. And clearly the media apparatus in his country isn't going to be able to hold him accountable because he's demonstrated what the punishment for speech and what he would view as dissenting speech is going to be.
Mm.
Going to be vicious murder, exile, you become an unperson, whatever. So there's not going to be any accountability there, and so it's hard. I feel like it's hard to sustain that push for accountability from such a distance from us and even from allies in Europe or whoever wants to kind of get on the justice for Jamal train. It's still going to be it's still just going to be hard to sustain that because that at some point you're kind of just, it's like a hole in the water where you throw money, right? Like it's going, it's not going to get it. It's most likely not going to get anywhere.
I'd love to see I just love to see both thoughts in the same breath from my news. Like, it's okay in my mind to say, let's have the discussion of we need to deal with autocratic regimes and we need to cooperate with them on the world stage. And they're going to do things that we don't support. Or do we draw a line like this? Like, if we were true fundamentalists about the sanctity of journalism, we would say, okay, we're cutting all ties with Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Even if that impacts geopolitical stability and like that kind of thing. So it's okay to have both things. It's okay for me to say, or I heard a newscaster say of like, well, we believe in the freedom of the press and we would never murder our own journalists. So we don't like this with Saudi Arabia, but also we cannot avoid the inconvenient truth that they are a player in this thing that does this, that, and the other, and here's why. It's like both things can be true.
Right. There can be that need for interdependence, but you can also it's like, what kind of partner do you want to have? Yeah. Right? Like, how open do you want your relationship to be? How there's some people that like monogamy and other people that want an open relationship, and it's really just a matter of kind of determining what everybody's comfortable with and what are everybody's values and what are you willing to, where do you actually draw the line? Where is it practical to? What was it? I think, and then, I think it was maybe Margaret Thatcher or somebody who said, you may have to fight a battle more than once before you can win it. So it's going to kind of be this, I think, with some of these regimes, we've been fighting the same human rights battle with China, for example, forever.
Right.
We're going to continue to trade with them because and they're going to continue to trade with us because we have to now. Like, we've started this train rolling, and if either one of those if any part of that train gets derailed, everything kind of gets derailed.
Right.
So again, trying to exert pressure and leverage where you can and compel different behaviors from your friends and partners.
Yeah.
I think that's the trick, right? How effective can it be? And then how responsive are they going to be?
Right. Well, now we're back to gatekeepers. And I'm talking about when I criticize at least corporate media, it's usually about the omissions, not what they're saying. It's what they're not saying. So they're not talking about killing journalists. They're talking about geopolitical stability. And they step over to that. I'm like, well, no, I want you to be able to talk about both things. I can accept bad things, but what I can't accept is you ignoring a certain path. That just feels like propaganda.
Yeah. When I think these things kind of link up to your big question, when did we lose our respect for journalism? I think, and it also begs the question, like, how much, what do America, speaking now about Americans specifically, what do they really know about journalism as a profession, what goes into it, how it works. I think there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of misunderstanding about how, what I certainly think of, legacy journalism or beat reporting, for example, how that really works and how information that's gathered, who tells you to go get the information, how the information is gathered, how it's reassembled and presented, who decides how it's presented. So, this idea of the gatekeeper theory, it's an old theory. It was
Yeah,
developed in
let's
the
go into more of that.
40s. So it was developed in the 40s, and I'm blanking on the name of the guy. Let's say like Tom Cole or somebody, but I don't think.
Keeper?
I beg your pardon?
Mr.
No,
Keeper?
Mr.
Yeah.
Keeper.
Yeah.
He's I think it's communications professor.
Okay.
And it lives in the realm of communications. It's called gatekeeper theory, and it lives in the realm of communications and media studies. And so the idea of gatekeepers, they exist throughout the media ecosystem. So editors, beat reporters, news anchors or presenters, TV media producers, everybody from the top levels, the owner, the owner of a newspaper, for example, think of somebody like Cat Graham, who very rarely liked to weigh in on what to print and what not to print, and they generally tried to keep her out of stuff. But if she had an opinion or if it was a big deal, before they went and broke the Watergate story, they went and talked to her. Same thing with Pentagon Papers. Like, what do you want to do with this? And she said, print that shit. So, but they went and checked, right? Like, hey, this is it's your family's paper. It's yours. What do you want us to do with this?
Right.
Deal. So you get input. And there's also other people that we don't think of in that area. So, for example,
interesting.
So, like, those people we think of as like media professionals, right? They work for a newspaper, they work for a TV. So, other media gatekeepers, PR firms or client relation firms.
So,
let's say you hire a public relations firm to help you shape a story that might be difficult or unsettling to somebody.
Okay.
So there's a lot of layers to who. It's basically who controls the spigot, who controls where it goes.
Yeah. Would this be more of like, I'm a PR firm, or you've got a story you're struggling with, I'm going to give you advice, and it's going to include some critique of General Motors, versus, okay, I'm not going to do that because I'm not going to get hired by the next company that might have a bigger tie to General Motors.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's like the old idea. The old idea is that you really don't, like in sales, I always kind of have a rule where I do my best not to say anything bad about my competitors' products or their company.
Because you might work for them one day.
Might work for them one day, right? Or somebody that I'm even working with, right? Like even in my own company or whatever, like I might work for that person. That person can end up being my boss at some point. Yeah. So using a little discretion and understanding that if you live in the communications field, if you live and work and play in that yard, that you're going to be bumping against these people throughout your career, right? So yeah, you don't want to end up saying something bad about somebody who could be your employer. And that can go both ways. It's not just
how's it go the other way?
Private companies, General Motors can hire a PR firm to go and talk to people at newspapers, or to go and talk to people at
fun think tanks and research papers,
or they go and they pitch a story, right? So yes, this story is going to break, right? Well, I work for Salvo, Schultz, and Schneider, and I'm a PR firm here in Detroit, and I want to talk to you about this green initiative that General Motors is doing. We're really hoping that we can inform you about it, so that as you present this information about the upsurge in sales of heavy trucks and SUVs that we've been doing, you can also, this gives you a broader context in which to present that story so that you know the full range of things that we're doing to be helpful and right.
Right,
Something
right.
like right. So
What
maybe
is
I,
the thing called? There's another piece that's even more insidious. It was the published content or something. It was that it looks like a news article, but it's really an ad.
yeah. Okay.
What's it called?
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. Stanford just did a study, and I'm not going to remember exactly when or the name, but I can follow up with it or we can link to it at some point. But I think they found that 80%, something like 80% of high school students in the survey didn't follow up or weren't able to research particularly photos and pictures that were used in online media, and a nearly similar amount of college students were not able to discern the difference between an actual published news story from a media source, regardless of political spectrum, and
Right.
an ad.
An ad. Oh,
Um, and it's kind of shocking. It's kind of
yeah,
shocking.
yeah.
Um, and so when you think that there's all of these different people that work that fill that gatekeeper function. Um, if we look back and think about the evolution of like a mainstream media gatekeeper, we used to predominantly rely on a small amount of what we now call legacy media outlets, right? It's predominantly print. So maybe it was whatever major newspaper. A lot of cities actually had two, a daytime and an evening paper, right? So there was the CJ, and then there was the Louisville Times for a long time. That paper literally folded, forgive the pun, and um, and it became just the CJ. So that limited news and circulation, right? Because the Louisville Times, I think, was a smaller, less expensive to print paper,
Right.
if I remember correctly. So circulation changed. Um, and then CJ got kind of absorbed or brought into the Gannett umbrella. So now it's really similar to all the other Gannett papers. So fewer and fewer gatekeepers in the process. And that happened nationwide. Um, and then in TV in the past, it was 3 or 4 networks: ABC, NBC,
Yeah.
CBS. And we had Walter Cronkite, Edward R. Murrow,
Mhm.
Tom Brokaw, Dan Rather. We had these few people that came up as actual correspondents and beat reporters and traveled for stories. They started in print and they brought that to the news. So there was a translation between, almost like somebody reading you the paper with some visual aid, right? That has morphed. There's so much more. There's just so many more outlets or inlets, if you like ways in to reach people. There's a Knight professor of journalism ethics at Washington Lee University, Ale Colomb, who I read sometimes, and he says there's an equation he uses, and it's velocity plus volume equals volatility. So all the news on the internet moves so fast and it assaults us with so much that the outcome becomes unpredictable and more likely to be dangerous. Because we can't discern, the faster it moves in and the more of it that comes, it becomes harder and harder to discern what's been researched, what hasn't.
Right. Is this similar to like the fire hose?
Yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah, same idea. Um, yeah, how much is coming through and how much
Right.
clogs the media space. There's so much in the space. Um, so it's tricky because we've got these older gatekeepers, legacy gatekeepers, if you will,
Right.
publishers at major newspapers. And that doesn't just because it's a major organization. I mean, if you think about a place like Fox, who's the gatekeeper, right?
Ultimately, was Murdoch or whatever his name is?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's before it was Roger Ailes. Nothing happened at that network that Roger Ailes didn't
Right.
approve, right? He was the ultimate decider, unless it came down from the Murrows to him. Otherwise, he ran it, and it all kind of filtered through him. He was the ultimate gatekeeper and decider of everything, of the optics, of the message, of the tone. The gatekeepers are responsible.
And they knew they didn't have to be directly told. They knew what would piss them off.
Sure, the culture, the tone, the standards of the organization were well known. They were very established on purpose. Like that's just as they are at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Chicago Trib, which is actually a fairly conservative paper.
Right.
This idea that all newspapers are liberal is bunk. Like,
yeah.
it is a pretty conservative paper, comparatively, right?
Right.
The LA Times, shockingly, fairly conservative paper compared to
right.
others, right?
Well, let me chime in here. Oh, wait, I don't know.
Sure, please do. I feel like I'm rambling, and I don't want to get too off topic.
Well, I was trying to switch speaker view too, which I'm going to stop doing that because I can't get my speaker. Anyway, I'm always reminded of one of the ways of gatekeeping. It's not that somebody like me is on corporate news and then I say something and get canceled. Though we have proof of that. Phil Donahue was the first thing that came to mind, but there's several other high profiles of like, they were doing whatever, and then they said something, and then they never got invited back for some mysterious reason. Mm-hmm. But it's not even that. It's somebody like me is not going to get hired in the first place, and so it leads to that omission.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I think.
So what triggers do you have to identify gatekeeping in process while you're watching the news? Or is even that a question to be able to?
Well, I think for me, it comes across in the presentation of if you think of the story that you're absorbing as the product, right? That's the product that you're being sold, because you are being sold that product. And you're paying for that product by paying for your cable, who pays for the ads and bringing Fox News or whatever. If you have Comcast, you're underwriting Fox News.
Right.
That you just do. Like whoever your cable company, like you don't have to pay them for ads. Like that's how they get their money. It's like $40 per cable subscriber per year or something like that they make. I can't remember. Right. That they just make just for being on cable. So I think I look at the final product and I listen to the tone as the story is being presented, or I look for the tone and language that gets used when I read a particular story. Are the writers, are they able to write with some nuance? Are they able to kind of really convey the smaller parts and the intricacies of the story, or is it just a blob of information that's been crunched into this space because that's how much space there is? Does it have, what are the connotative aspects of the language that's being used? Is it
right?
Are the words chosen, because especially in print, all the words are chosen.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's somebody sees them before they go out. And they are.
Well, it's like how assertive they might be or whatever. Like,
right.
You're talking at me, or I always use the word qualifiers of like, I believe this, but I also understand it's my belief. If I hear that, then I understand at least a recognition of bias.
Sure. Or are there sources cited according to so and so? If you're going to cite a poll, cite an actual poll and say where it's from. Don't just say, well, I mean, people are saying, well, what people? A non-zero number of people. Well, that can be one, right? Like, I really hate, it's a pet peeve of mine when in actual news stories, they'll say, a number of people, a number of sources reported this. Zero is a number too. Right. So like, I mean, like, how specific are you?
Well, technically 0 is not a number. I'm messing with you. It's a math thing.
Okay. But for the purposes of communication.
Right.
So that's why it's funny, like a non-zero number of people.
Right.
Well, that's interesting because negative numbers are numbers too, and those are non-zero numbers. So,
that's all, 10 people voting. I'm not sure.
Right. Well, again, right. So I look for those. Those are clues to me. I look for how it's put together, how it's presented. Is it presented as entertainment, or is it entertaining? Because if it is, I'm not sure I want my news to be entertaining. I kind of want it to be boring. I kind of want it to be black and white in a paper, kind of boring. I don't really want a lot of infographics. If I want that, I'll go on BuzzFeed and take whatever. So like, that's not necessarily what I want. And that's me as a news consumer. So I look for those things. I look for hints of research, sources cited, that kind of thing.
Okay, and I do a similar thing, and this is just in any discussion and argument, just from, our early years of doing debate. This was this thing of, do I get the sense that you've made at least some effort to prove yourself wrong, and then realize, and that strengthens your argument, because if you can prove yourself wrong, you switch your argument, and if you have trouble doing that with an honest effort, you feel stronger in your argument.
Sure. Or at least make some allowance for some error in your position. Or what is it? One of the strongest things you can do in a debate is anticipate somebody's objections and admit to them before they get to it.
Preemptive nullification. Yeah,
exactly. So instead of just blasting through with your thing, and then when they bring up the debate, you say, no, that's just not true.
Because you're just yelling about your perspective. I've already said I can see both.
Right.
So you're the jerk. I win the argument.
Well, so it gives you credibility.
Yeah, it's a credibility thing.
It's a credibility thing.
And also good practice if you do it honestly, but in debate tactics, it's
but for the purposes of discussion and debate too, like you said, it nullifies one of their potential arguments. Now they have to cross that out and skip to the next thing. Damn it! And you took.
But I was going to lead with "You're a jerk."
Admitted you're a jerk. I hate it when they do that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing. I think, and with at risk of kind of monopolizing this a bit, but I was thinking about this idea of like new gatekeepers, like these modern, because the job really falls to the public now to be independent gatekeepers of our own news, right? We decide what the flow is to us. How much are we going to point the fire hose right at our face? Are we going to turn it up all the way and try to swallow all the water? Or are we going to turn it down? Or are we going to pick a smaller hose? Or what are we going to do, right? Are we just going to let it rain over us? Or we're going to be just, a little bit discriminating. And so I think an upside of that job is that there's a lower barrier to entry into the media space, and we have access to so much more information. I think that one of the downsides of that is that the vast majority of the population, at risk of sounding judgmental, and I don't mean to be, but they've limited, if any, training in journalism, ethics, communication, media studies, philosophy, any of the things that kind of had traditionally gone into decision-making about informing other people.
Right. This leads to the, when I'm thinking about, a thought in my head, and now we've got about 10 more minutes, like, what is the prime number of people that could supply basic communal needs in a Chicago neighborhood? And how much would that, like, how many people do I need in how many apartments and how much money, like all this kind of thing. And it was like, of course you need a doctor and you need a teacher and you need this, that, and the other. And so one of my this is a side tangent of like, I want to crunch those numbers because that seems like a worthwhile goal. But that leads me to none of us should be generalist in this way that we're being asked to be in news. It's like, because we're interested in this topic, we're going to spend our extra hour a day in the topic. But not everybody is. This is our hobby. But in our social group, we have people who say, you know what, I don't follow the news. What's this story about? Or who should I vote for? That I get those questions because they know I'm in that. Now, if I have baseball questions or want to go to a baseball game or anything like that, I don't do any of that work. I go ask my baseball people.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and that's okay because you think of in the old school tribe, you know, it's this inherent need to have a purpose and to feel like you're contributing. And so you have divisions of labor. And it's
teachers, right.
It's okay not to know about the news, whatever. It's not okay not to care about everything 0%. You know, you don't want to care about everything 100% because you'll go insane. But you should have people in your group, in your social circle, in your network that, and again, this is about, since we don't, I'm getting way off topic of, since we don't operate tribes the same way, we have to figure this out. But it's like, it's okay not to know about the news. It's not okay to say, since I don't know, I'm ignoring it all. What you should be saying is, who do I trust? Not on the news, not who do I trust in my family, in my group of friends?
To help me understand it or interpret it or right. Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing. I mean, find the people that do have some idea about those things. That's helpful. I think it's another potential downside really is, and we're kind of addressing it, doing what we're doing right now, but a lack of rigorous debate and research before anything is ever published.
Right.
Right. You can just have an opinion, go and present it, and there's no and then so there's a lack of mandated multiple sourcing, fact checking apparatus. I was taught to always have no fewer than 3 to 5 sources for every story. They all had to line up. They all had to. They were all checked.
Now it's how fast can you get a picture of Paris Hilton's crotch?
Right, or whatever. Right, it's or just how many people can you get to say the thing that you say. So okay, we want the people to believe that there really is a dangerous caravan of immigrants that are going to storm the country. So I want you to go to this place. So go find people who are afraid of that and talk to them. Right? Don't find any people who aren't afraid of that. Don't talk to them.
Don't talk to them. Yeah.
I'm just going to go and find people to talk to, right? Or you just find your friends who are afraid of that, and you.
Well, we did this when I was selling memberships at the zoo, and I had a team of people who would go around outside. You ended up selling it to the people who are most likely you. I was like, well, we have more, we have more black people at the zoo than white people, but we have more white people buying memberships. I'm like, what is that? And so we observed it and like, well, you're only approaching those people. It's not that you were racist in any way. It's just, well, I mean, I guess
maybe some implicit bias or something.
Right, implicit bias, because it's like you just felt more comfortable. Like you have to work up the energy to go sell something, and this is a free zoo, so it's like, why would you buy it anyway? So it's like it just kept skewing. So we have workshops of like how to get over that anxiety. Not secretly we found out you're a racist and you didn't know about it. It was more of how do you just get more confident in selling so you talk to everybody and you don't that kind of
thing. Right. Like it's a lesson in we call it qualifying the account.
Okay.
Right? So you go and you check in with an account. You have lunch, you look around, you look at what's on, in my case, you look at what's on their back bar, you look at their wine list. Do they even sell wine? When I was selling only wine, if I went to a place that didn't sell wine, I'd enjoy my hamburger, have a
Walk
beer,
right out the door.
tip the bartender and say thanks a lot, and I'll be out. Right? Like, I'm not going to try to build a wine program from scratch from somebody who doesn't want it.
Right.
That kind of thing. If that's all, if it's a Coors and Crown account, like that's all it is, then that's fine. It is not a qualified account. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right.
So, there is again, it kind of goes back to finding an audience, finding your audience and understanding what do they really need. You have to understand what your goal is too. And so I think that's the trick.
Okay.
I think that's the trick. And how much do you want to? There's another quote from a press critic, Tom Rosenstiel, I think his name is, and I'm going to forget who he writes for, but he made an assertion once that the goal of fake news is not to make people believe the lie. It's to make them doubt all news.
Yeah.
And
gotcha.
So it's kind of like looking at again, back to your trigger, the things that, what am I looking for? What are my cues or tells that I look for? Are they being the speaker, the presenter of the information? Does their goal seem to be to help me better understand an issue? Or do I want them to believe everybody who's talking about that issue?
Yeah. My similar thing of like, are they going through the same process I am? Do I feel that?
Yeah, like how similar our process, or would they even understand my process, right? Like if I went to them and said, hey, like, did you do these things? Would they laugh at me?
Right. Now, this whole thing gives me a lot of hope, because the other number that rolls around in my head is you only need 3.5% of the population to start a revolution. And this is historically mathematically correct. So it's the idea of finding the audience. I don't need the majority of Americans to believe me or be interested in the thing I'm interested in. I just need to connect with the 3.5% of Americans that already do. And I need them to realize we're out there. This was the beginning of the internet. It's like, I don't need the majority of the country to follow my newscast, crap show, newscasts. I just need to find a way to connect to the people who are going to be a qualified audience.
Sure.
And then an army. Yeah. We've got about just a couple more minutes. Anything you wanted to end on Gatekeepers?
I think we've covered it all. I mean, I think for my part, I think the most important thing, and I'd like to continue to talk about it because it does touch, there's so many pieces of it. I'd like to revisit it at some point. But I think as with most of the things we've discussed, so much of it really does fall these days to kind of a personal responsibility to be more informed, to educate yourself and seek out more, like we're doing, talking about multiple sources, but actually seeking them out, understanding the difference, and then kind of making up your mind about how you want to learn. Because the more you actually learn, you'll start to identify people, I think, will start to identify these different things. They'll start to see them on their own, right? They'll be a little more apparent. The more you learn and the more broadly you read or seek out.
Right.
But I think that's, yeah.
That was a big thing. We always hear the education is important. And I guess my take on that in life is I want to encourage people. It's like, education is also fun. It's not just important and critical. It can be enjoyable.
Yeah, you can actually enjoy it. That's right. That's right.
Well, all right. Well, we will definitely kind of dive into some more, like, as you said, especially around gatekeepers and in general, these discussions, there's a lot to pick apart. So I hope to talk with you before next Sunday. and maybe we can flesh out some more. But
Yeah, that'd be
otherwise,
great.
there we go. Let's try not to kill any journalists on our way home. And
Certainly not. Swerve. Swerve to avoid. Swerve to
swerve to
avoid.
avoid. All right. Well, thank you,
Swerve
Dave.
as possible. Yes.
All right. Well, I'm going to pause out here if you want to hang on the line. Again, it's February 28th, and we are figuring out the truth as we know it. So.